name is Roger Anderson, and I am excited to share with you a talk about Garfield, an exceptionally multilingual American, and his SLA investments, or his investments in second language acquisition. Again, my name is Roger Anderson. I'm an assistant professor of languages and cultures at Central State University here in Ohio. So first thing I need to clarify, are we talking about this Garfield, President James A. Garfield of Ohio? We are not. So I am just borrowing his name, and that was something that I agreed with the participant to do in order to help keep his identity anonymous. President Garfield was legendarily reported to be able to write in Greek in his right hand and Latin with his left hand at the same time. So for that reason, it seemed appropriate to borrow his name for Garfield. Garfield is a multilingual American living in the rural United States. Multilingual is his choice of word rather than polyglot. He does know 15 languages and has studied 50 other languages. Garfield is a veteran of the Vietnam War and has had many different positions within the national security and intelligence fields. Garfield is a caretaker of elderly family members. He is an exceptional L2 language learner, second language learner, particularly through the ISA, the Intense Summer Academy, which is a pseudonym for a language school here in the United States. Garfield is an adjunct instructor of French and Hebrew and Japanese and Chinese and. Garfield's 15 languages are these, and he does have a bachelor's degree in French and Spanish and a German minor and Mandarin Chinese and Russian, as well as a master's degree in Arabic, and has studied 50 other languages, which I could not fit here. Our story begins in a rural public library, potentially one like this. And so I wanted to sort of use this as a framing, and you'll understand why later. What is the point of this project? So myself, having studied education, and I'm very interested in second language acquisition, or SLA. It is a very complex phenomenon, and that is something that was agreed upon by a meeting of scholars in 2016. They called themselves the Douglas Fir Group, such as the tree here, and they brought together all sorts of scholars to set forth a vision of all of the components that are included within the processes of someone learning and using a second language. Here, a second language does not mean the second language that you learn. It means any language that you learn that is not your first or mother tongue. So throughout this presentation, I will use the term SLA and L2 to refer to a language that one learns that is not their original language. So the framework that I'm using is Darvin and Norton's 2015 model of investment. So investment is a concept that comes from the identity tradition within SLA research. And basically it sees that the components of identity, capital, and ideology all converge in interesting ways to create a learner's investment in learning a second language. So that model informed my thinking and my questions, as well as the procedures for undertaking this project. So I wanted to investigate and honor Garfield's investments in his second language acquisition. My focus question was, why did he learn language X? What was his language learning trajectory? And so I'm going to talk about the methods and analysis, and I want to share with you a brief timeline and sort of a mapping of his language learning, as well as share themes that emerged and provide some evidence for those themes. And then I'll conclude by sharing some of the takeaways for me about Garfield's investment in his language learning. So through two conversations, phone calls, Garfield was interviewed. I interviewed Garfield, lasting over 10 hours. The calls were 2 days apart, and they occurred in August of 2020. They were recorded, transcribed, and analyzed using Transana, which is a qualitative software for data analysis. Garfield did offer his consent to participate in this project. And my relationship to Garfield, so Garfield and I studied Arabic together for 4 summers, and so that's how I got to know him. A little bit about myself. I also am an aspiring multilingual person, so French, Arabic, Spanish, a little bit of Hebrew, and a little bit of Indonesian. So I am very interested in Garfield's passions and feel that that provided me some empathy to understand Garfield. As far as drawbacks, maybe that meant that I overlooked some things that another investigator would have seen, or maybe I took the project in directions that they would not have. So just some key events and periods within Garfield's story. At age 6, Garfield spent 6 months in a coma, and I'll talk about that. At age 16, yes, that is not a typo, at age 16, with his parents' consent, he enlisted in the Army, the U.S. Army, and was part of the Vietnam War. He returned home and faced many obstacles, but continued his language acquisition and even lived for a period in homelessness. Throughout his life, Garfield has had many different careers, 4 parallel careers, as he says, 1 in the active Army, 1 in the Army Reserves, 1 in the National Security Agencies, and then 1 in customer service, as well as teaching and being a caretaker. And so while he was being a caretaker, he continued his language study and earned a master's degree, as I mentioned. So I do need to specify that fitting one person's life trajectory of language study into a 40-minute presentation is impossible. I recognize that. And so I did want to just acknowledge that and mention that any mistakes that I have made here are my own. So this, in a nutshell, are what I consider to be the main languages that really were crucial to Garfield. So he grew up speaking English in an all English-speaking family in rural United States. And he did have one family member, a great-grandmother, who spoke German with him. And then these first 3 languages in this orangish bronze color, these are 3 languages that that Garfield identified as being ones that were part of his library quest, is a term that I'm calling it. So Garfield was in a coma for 6 months after a sledding accident in which he hit his head. He woke up, he had slurred speech, and he was very fearful that his life trajectory would be one in which he would be considered a person with special needs. And so to prove himself, he decided that he would read every single book in that public library. And so he started with A, and that was ancient Greek. So these first 3 were part of that library quest. And he also had the opportunity to use Greek, ancient Greek and modern Greek, with restaurant workers and classmates who were part of an immigrant community to the rural area in which he lived. Spanish, French, there was a cooking show on public television which also piqued his interest in learning French. Latin, an instructor realized how bored he was in class and realized they had Latin together in common, so he continued his Latin study with Mrs. Galley, which is a pseudonym. Judo and Russian and German, these 3 languages I have put in red, and that is because he was ardently passionate about learning these languages, and we'll talk about these more in detail. German was for his family heritage, and he did get to go to Europe for ancestral discovery, if you will. A few of these in this orangish color, Portuguese, Hebrew, and Gujarati, he learned in part because he felt that a Spanish linguist should know some Portuguese. An Arabic linguist should know some Hebrew. Someone who studies Sanskrit, they also can learn Gujarati. And so those I have chosen to put in that color. Chinese we will talk about. Chinese is in a separate category, but that is where most of his energy, I would argue, has gone, his language study. And then Russian, he was absolutely passionate about Russian, but then also tried to parlay that into an economic opportunity with a national security need containing the USSR during the Cold War. Same thing with Swahili. There was an economic opportunity, again, with national security after the U.S. embassies were bombed in Africa. And then purple, Arabic and Sanskrit. I put these in purple because he was given material in which he could not read anything that was written there, and that really baffled him that someone who speaks Russian and Chinese and Japanese and French and Spanish could not make out a word of these texts. And so it was really these texts, a magazine, a mystery magazine that his cousin gave him, and then a book that was given to him at the airport by a Hare Krishna person really motivated him to try and understand these languages. So we will come back to this later. I also wanted to point out his Backburner Projects, which were many, many, many additional languages he studied simply because he had the opportunity. So he met someone, for example, Finnish, a weightlifting coach at the YMCA, or was given materials and just had them as sort of interesting projects to pursue secondarily. So some of the key themes that appeared from the data. So Garfield's investments. So the first thing is proving himself. He felt that he needed to prove himself to others. He had a fear that he would be in a track for a special needs person, and he did not want that for himself. And so therefore he took this self-study up that I mentioned. He also, throughout his life, has had to sort of prove his proficiencies, primarily to Americans who did not believe his abilities to speak all these languages or to the level that he is able to speak them. Also, he had to overcome this aspect of not having official degrees in many of these languages. Not until later in his life did he get, for example, a bachelor's degree in Spanish or in French, or a master's degree in Arabic. So there's always a need to prove himself. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to read all of these quotes, but I encourage, if you're interested, they are super fascinating and rich with detail. So to sort of summarize, he hit his head in a sledding accident when he was 6 years old, the first time he ever went sledding. His parents did not believe him when he said that he hit his head until he passed out. He was then in a coma for six months, and his parents did not think that he was going to survive. And then the doctors told him that if he did survive, told his parents that if he did survive, he would live like a vegetable. He would not have any quality of life. As it happens, after 6 months, he did open his eyes and he was able to understand everyone around him, except his speech was slurred for almost a year. And so he overheard people talking, and they said that they were going to place him in special education. And at that time, that meant that they took kids that were like that and they put them in the basement, in a room that was behind the boiler room, in the hopes that they would just quit school and so they would never have to see them or work with them again. And so Garfield wanted to avoid that at all costs. And so he set out on this library quest. And a related theme was the preciousness and the scarcity of SLA resources. So Garfield grew up in a rural area and he grew up in a poor household, which those are his words. He never envisioned himself going to college just out of the fact that he couldn't afford it. And so materials were very scarce. And so that did shape his appreciation for materials. And so when there was a Spanish book available to him, it became very precious to him. So much so that anytime there was an opportunity to speak with a Spanish-speaking person or someone who spoke Greek, that was a wonderful opportunity for him. So Garfield did become an opportunivore for second language acquisition, in part because of this economically constrained trajectory that he saw himself heading in. And so, for example, he talks about going to his maternal grandmother's house, and she had a viewfinder, which was a little gadget in which you could see pictures, like a slide projector in a sense, as well as stamps, her stamp collection. And so he asked his mother, "Do you think I might be able to go, to France or Germany or something?" And she just laughed and laughed. She said, "We are poor. you're never going to be able to afford to go to any of these things. And so then he realized that when he was getting out these language books and studying these languages and speaking with people in a different language, he says now as an adult, he was having a vicarious travel experience by learning this language. And probably the most common phrase that came up in the interviews was, "I still have that up in the attic." So even to this day, these materials remain precious for Garfield. Another theme, so this is a picture of Mount Fuji in Japan. And so Garfield did get to go to Japan 5 times because that was one of his major passion projects. So these 1, 2, 3, 4 languages I've identified as being sort of his passion languages, languages that he studied out of love of culture, love of the language, and his own personal aspirations, rather than any sort of economic opportunity or sort of utilitarian use for them. So ancient Greek, Japanese, Russian, and Arabic. So briefly, ancient Greek was the first second language that he was studying as part of this library quest. And he did have a fascinating moment, which he explained that the library worker saw that he was studying a foreign language, and Garfield realized that that worker could not read what he was reading and could not see that this word said house, even though to him it clearly said house. And that was his first realization that there are different systems of language, different systems of alphabet, and that it was just a fascinating experience that he had this sort of power, this ability that was not universal. Japanese, we will see this, the influence of a judo instructor who had spent 20 years living in Japan and had married a Japanese woman and really influenced Garfield, so much so that Garfield wanted to live and die in Japan, and he wanted to marry a Japanese woman, and just envisioned that being his future. And we'll see how that did not end up being the case. Russian, he read Anna Karenina, a novel, and fell in love with it and wanted to read it and study that language, and then ended up attempting to parlay that into a national security career as well. And then Arabic, as I mentioned, he was given a magazine in Arabic, and when he was finally able to decode some of that writing, he explained sort of the euphoric feeling he had when doing so, and just a sense of accomplishment, which he also found with Chinese and Japanese as well. So this I want to share with you. So during his library quest, he said that instead of just picking up the next book in the row, A, B, C, D, he actually looked for a book on Japanese, inspired by his judo instructor, and he found Japanese in a Nutshell. And he got that book out, and he said, "I still have my notebook in the attic with my own writing, where I tried to imitate how to write these Japanese characters." And he really wanted to get his black belt in judo, and he thought, maybe I'll be like Mr. Smith, my judo instructor, just marry someone that's Japanese and have kids and speak Japanese and English. Mr. Smith had been in Japan with the US government, and then Garfield said that he wanted something different for himself. He envisioned himself pretty much living and dying there, unlike Mr. Smith, who came back to rural America, and that's what he wanted to do. And so we will see in a bit why that did not happen. Another theme that was important to this story is the theme of individual people. So this is a photo I selected because Garfield related a story in which he went to Japan and he was in front of a temple, and there were many Japanese school children, and they all wanted to take his picture. And at that time, things were not digital, and so he ended up mailing photos to them and kept in touch with a couple of them throughout many years. And one young woman actually ended up with a career in the tourism industry, due in large part to her interaction and experience with Garfield, who helped her to understand the asset that was her country's culture, and just that the whole world is out there and is interested in Japanese culture. So, touching upon a couple of these individuals and how significant they were, whether they knew it or not, the library aide, when he was 6 years old, let him and checked out books in her name for him, because children did not have the privilege of taking out books like that. And so that was totally life-changing for him. Garfield's father was a Korean War veteran, and so he spent time in Asia and had pictures with Asian girlfriends, and I suspect that that probably also had an impact on Garfield. The Army recruiter we will talk about, the judo instructor, his cousin in the military who gave him this Arabic magazine, and key teachers who encouraged him, particularly at the intense summer academy, really altered his trajectory. And so in this quote, we'll see how one person, the Army recruiter, influenced his trajectory in a negative way. So at age 16, Garfield, enlisted in the Army, and he had a contract to go to the Defense Language Institute to learn Japanese. And he was thrilled, and things were going to be good, and his life was going to be on an excellent path. He was going to be able to study what he loved and wouldn't have to pay for it because the military would pay for it. And then he got a call from the local Army recruiter, who happened to be a deacon at his church as well. And he told Garfield, they're not teaching Japanese anymore because World War II is over, and the U.S. government has no need for Japanese linguists anymore and won't in the future. But, you could pick another language. Garfield responded, I don't want another language. They said, well, you have to choose, you have a choice of three. I said, I put down my choices. I put my first choice, Japanese. Second choice, I wrote Japanese. Third choice, Japanese. I said, you know this. You've known me all this time. You know, since I was a little kid going to the church, you've known that I've been focused on going to Japan, learning Japanese, and improving my judo so that someday I might be able to win a medal in judo. And he said he was very distraught over the whole thing, and he thought, well, if I have to choose something else, I just won't go. And later on, Garfield found out when he went to the Defense Language Institute for his Chinese class, because that is what the military wanted him, this recruiter wanted him to do, was to study Chinese, and that was needed for the Vietnam War. Yes, Chinese was needed for the Vietnam War. So he went to the Defense Language Institute, and he was talking with the person in front of him who was a sergeant, and he was a private, and they just asked him, what language are you here for? And the sergeant said, I'm here to study Japanese. And then Garfield said, they don't have Japanese anymore. They don't need that. The government, no one in the government would ever want Japanese again because World War II was over, repeating what his recruiter had told him. And so the sergeant showed him his papers and said that the Japanese class starts tomorrow. So essentially, my recruiter lied to me, and I thought, wow, the deacon of the church. And I went through life when I looked into it, and it turns out that he, the deacon, the Army recruiter, had a certain quota of people he had to get to study Chinese. So I thought, wow, I couldn't believe it. Because of his lie, it totally wrecked and altered the course of my life. And for the next decade, I just wouldn't go to any church. It just left a bad taste in my mind. That someone who knew me, knew my interest in Japanese, and knew this, and knew how much I wanted to do that. And it turns out it was available, and I could have gone, but because he had a quota for Chinese. So, again, one person impacting his trajectory. Nonetheless, another theme that was apparent from all of this, the interviews, was a service ethos. Garfield comes from a family in which military service is a legacy, and so he was very aware of that. And also an ethos of caretaking, taking care of elderly people. It's what you do. The similar ethos was found with his teaching. He feels that he is inspiring his learners to study second languages and to use those as a non-native speaker. He sees himself as a role model for them, especially someone with such vast experience in actually using these languages outside of academic contexts. A service ethos was also on display through his stories of welcoming immigrants and foreigners or new Americans who did not speak English. And so there were many stories that he shared where he was welcoming them in their language and they were just shocked. So, for example, he shared a story of going to Wyoming to help a cousin build a log cabin, and some Mexican laborers were also involved in building, and there were communication breakdowns, and so Garfield helped to broker those language differences, and he said that they were just shocked that some strange little American guy was able to talk to them in their own language. And so he thought that for at least about 3 generations, I'm quite sure that story about this American guy speaking their language was able to help them would be passed from generation to generation. Even though Garfield recognized that he wasn't paid for this service, it was just a service that you did to help these new Americans be comfortable in the new society. Another theme that came up was living language, using the language for living, for daily purposes. This first was the title of the book series in which Garfield picked up at the library during his library quest. But it really encapsulates his approach to teaching and using a second language. If you want to speak the L2, you must speak the L2. And this seems pretty obvious, but at that time, and probably still today, there are classrooms in which learners are not speaking the language much, or learners are, doing audiolingual methods or methods that are not very communicative. And so for him, this was a critique of some learners as well as a critique of some approaches and his approach to pedagogy. Because of this, he fell in love with the approach taken at the Intense Summer Academy, the ISA, which is not the real name of the program, which was a language school here in the United States, in which Garfield became the champion attendee. He had participated in this program for over a decade and outlasted all other learners as well as all other instructors except for maybe 1 or 2. So he was very passionate about this program. And so describing the intensity of the program and the strictness of this approach of speak the language all the time, no English, he talked about the fact that the program told family members that you cannot contact your loved one, your learner, in any way, shape, or form in English for 9 weeks, the duration of the program. And they were explicitly told that if you cannot go 9 weeks without talking to someone in your family in English, then come back some summer when you think you can. And he also went on to say that during the first week he was scared because 7 students were expelled from the program. Why were they expelled? Because they were on their cell phones speaking English. And Garfield so appreciated this approach and this commitment to speaking the language that, again, he went back for a decade. Another theme that needs to be mentioned is getting over obstacles, particularly bureaucratic obstacles. This was a major impetus for his language studies. So I want to just focus on a couple of these languages because they're particularly fascinating. So Japanese, we talked about this. Another obstacle he encountered was the university to which he applied when he was out of the military to study Japanese as a major. He could not use the GI Bill for that because there was no major in Japanese at that time. There was only a minor. So therefore, he had to choose something else, and so he ended up choosing Russian as a major. Now, Russian, he was absolutely passionate about, to the degree that he actually left the military over Russian, remembering his experience of being tricked, in a sense, into Chinese away from Japanese. He was ready to re-enlist for another 6 years and planned on making his whole career in the military. He left the military because they would not guarantee him the opportunity to study Russian. And so he left the military and then used the GI Bill and majored in Russian. And then later, when he tried to make a career in the national security field using his Russian, he was told that at that time they had a glut of Russian linguists and he was not needed. Another obstacle was that because of geopolitics, he was never able to travel to Russia or to China, even though he would have absolutely loved it, because of geopolitics and because traveling there as a national security person would compromise one's security credentials and clearances. So he never had the opportunity to do so, which is unfortunate, but a reality. Swahili. So again, during his career with national security agencies, he had the opportunity to study Swahili because the U.S. embassies were bombed, and so there was a need for more Swahili-speaking people. And so there was a financial incentive to study Swahili. Pass a test and get this financial incentive, and then and also go to Africa for study. Well, he decided to self-study and passed this test with 98%, but was not given the financial reward because he had not participated in the program in Africa, and was also passed over for this opportunity for other people who he felt who he says did not pass the test. So again, this was sort of an obstacle that he never set out to study Swahili as like a life goal. Ended up doing it because he thought that it would be an interesting opportunity and the country needed it, but never got to use those skills in that capacity, and never got to go to Africa. This is sort of a recurring theme, that his self-study, because he was not officially credentialed, oftentimes became an obstacle for his economic advancement or professional advancement. So coming back to Spanish and French. So he really wanted to, he left his national security career, in order to take care of elderly parents or family members. And so he came back to rural the United States, and then he kept up with his language studies because there was a local educational institution nearby, and so he could take Spanish classes or French classes, and in the hopes of just continuing to study his languages and maintain them. And then he thought, I could have a career teaching these languages, or teaching Russian and Chinese here, because that's what I have degrees in, and bring these to this area. And at that time, there was no praxis exam for Russian and for Chinese. And so he was not able to do that. And so then he picked up French and Spanish, or Spanish, I should say, because that was a commonly taught language. And then French as well, because he thought that it would be fortuitous, it would be a good combination in case the French teacher was absent. He could just pop over and sub. And so he finished all of the Spanish and French courses and requirements and got BA degrees in them, actually, just by happenstance of having taken so many classes just for pleasure, and then took education courses. And the only aspect that he needed to complete in order to become certified to teach was a student teaching opportunity. And this, he never found the opportunity to do so, and he believes that was because of his age, because at this point he was not a freshly out of college 20-year-old, and so he never had the opportunity. And that's actually one of the reasons that led him to pursue a master's degree in Arabic, because he thought if he's pursuing a master's degree, then there would be opportunities for student teaching. Coming back to Chinese, at certain points in his national security career, he felt that he was passed over because he did not have an official degree in Chinese, even though he had taken years of Chinese study through the Defense Language Institute and other avenues, and had attained the highest levels of Chinese proficiency that the government had to offer. At other times, like speaking with a principal later to bring Chinese language classes to a high school in this rural area, he was not believed, because no American can speak Chinese correctly with tones and all those difficult characters. And so this, again, was a recurring theme, that people just didn't believe that he had those skills, when in fact he had been a part of the highest level of translation and interpretation with the U.S. government, as well as for Japanese, in which both of these languages had him involved as being an interpreter translator within the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo, as well as providing briefings to the White House using these languages. But I guess that wasn't good enough for educational institutions' credentialing areas. Another language, so Arabic. He had the opportunity to study Arabic, and did so for one semester, and then second semester was going to be abroad, to study abroad experience. However, the program asked for the funds prematurely, and he had not gotten his check yet from the Army Reserves, in which he was a part, and so he did not have the funds at that time to pay for the upcoming study abroad trip, and so he was not able to participate in that. So that sort of sidelined his study of Arabic for a while, and he never got to go to the Middle East. And yes, so he did pursue the master's degree later in order to have the opportunity to student teach. And then also, he was really hoping through his Arabic study at the intense summer academy, he was really hoping to study Iraqi in order to be able to share that and to be of good use for the various U.S. military and needs there, to combine service with economic opportunity and interest. But the language school did not offer Iraqi for their own reasons, and so he chose Moroccan and studied Moroccan, and this was also motivated by an excellent language instructor whose beliefs about speaking the language, the daily language, he shared with Garfield. Having completed the master's degree, he was hoping to pursue a PhD degree in Arabic at the same institution. However, the PhD program had not yet been formed as it was supposed to have been formed, and so he decided, well, most programs that are doctoral level for Arabic also require students to have studied Hebrew or another Semitic language. So he attended Hebrew summer intensive schools with the hopes of combining those into a PhD program. So as we can see, a variety of different obstacles that were motivating in their own unique ways. Another thing I want to mention as well is the feeling of achievement in getting over some of these obstacles. And I wanted to highlight one quote that was just fascinating with Arabic. So here is someone who has already mastered the highest levels of Japanese and Chinese, and then Russian as well, and was given a magazine in Arabic, and just felt totally baffled by the fact that he could not understand a word of it. So he was able to use the dictionary and figured out what he had was in fact a copy of Reader's Digest, the old magazine. And he said he felt so proud of himself. I don't know how to explain it. It was like an ecstasy. You know, it was like I was high on being able to accomplish this complex intellectual achievement. I was so thrilled I was able, to unravel the mysteries of the Arabic alphabet. I just thought that was a fascinating quote, and one that I can relate to. And then the last theme that came out and was just repeated throughout the interviews was this notion of serendipity, that things just happened inexplicably, and it, was significant and impacted his life, but there was no rhyme or reason why something happened. And it started even at the very beginning. His study of foreign language was totally an accident. So starting with hitting his head, and he could have ended up dead, right? But instead, he feels that it rewired his brain in a way that made him really excel in language acquisition. And so he feels very fortunate about that and cannot explain, the fortuitous nature of that. So there were many instances like that, positive as well as a few negative. So there was one, being the first person, I believe, in his family to earn a master's degree, actually the day before his graduation with the master's degree, his father tragically passed away. So I'm sure his father would have been immensely proud, himself having been a teacher in rural America. He also pointed out that the exact date of our interview happened the exact date of our graduation from the school together. And then another sort of closing quote, and I just think this was so typical because this shows just sort of the richness of these serendipitous events. During his career as a customer service person, representative, he worked with a man from Turkey. And so Garfield said, years and years and years ago, by happenstance, or was it happenstance, I often wonder. I happened to be across this guy that spoke Turkish. When I was young, my mother had gotten me this little record course that was in Turkish. I had never really listened to it, or, because I had all these other projects with Japanese and all this sort of thing. But I thought to myself, okay, when I have the time in the future, I'm going to do that. And I felt bad in a way because my mother spent the money to get it. But it was like the 100 most essential Turkish words and phrases. And I thought, okay, sometime I'm going to do that. So it was like a backburner thing for me. So then, I was working at X Inc. and I told my friend, the Turkish person, I said, see, I got this little Turkish course and booklet. You might be interested in seeing it. I know you're from Turkey. I just thought it might be good for you to see it and stuff. I showed it to him. He looked at the book and said, oh, yes, can I take this home and listen to this record? I said, yeah. I said, but, you're Turkish. Why would you want to listen to this record about beginning Turkish? He said, well, the guy that recorded this was my father. My father passed away. I just wanted to hear his voice again. Now, what are the odds of that? So many serendipitous moments just like that one were just fascinating. So bringing this to a close, Garfield's multiple investments in all of his languages, we can see there were a variety of reasons and motivating factors that were all coming together in interesting ways. And so we can't just say that his investment was because of service, or it was because of economic opportunity, or because of the coma. All of these things come together in really interesting, complex ways. And so for me, just some of the important takeaways that I will remember from Garfield's story is just what an incredible feat it is that one man can speak, communicate with the vast majority of the people living on planet Earth in a language that is not his first language. I mean, that is a remarkable feat, and especially for an American growing up in a largely monolingual context. Secondly, Garfield, throughout his many careers, has defended the United States in multiple ways in the most dangerous, life-threatening situations, period. And at the same time, Garfield is a xenophile. He loves foreign people, foreign places, foreign languages, and does not see the vast majority of them as a threat. And these two identities, I think, they're crucial for Garfield. Every single person he hears with an accent, he wants to know about them. He wants to ask them. He wants to find out about their culture and their home country. And I think that's just fascinating. Scarcity of resources, making the resources that are available all the more precious. Even L2 people, even the mailman who speaks Georgian, even the restaurant owner who speaks Gujarati, they all become precious resources for language acquisition and vicarious travel experience. Another point was just that self-study and veterans seem to face many more obstacles with traditional educational structures, and that seemed to be very apparent through Garfield's case. And then also, Garfield sees himself as a model for his learners. So inspiring his learners to study a language that is not their first language and use it. And that's what he did, and did so successfully. And so bringing our story back to the rural American public library in the community in which he was born and which he still lives, he has enriched that community by sharing all of his talents and his knowledge of the world and his experiences, and really made it a much more colorful experience for all of his learners and people who have known Garfield. And so that library, when they expanded the library and they had a brick patio with donors and whatnot, they gave him a brick in his name because of the amazing feat that one American boy who had woken up from a coma was able to learn 15 languages and study 50 others and do all of these incredible things. So that's the reason why that I felt that it was important to share the story of an exceptional multilingual American, Garfield. And so here are the credits for all of the photos that I have borrowed. And I thank you for listening through all of this, and hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.